When we look back at the Middle Ages, we rarely ask what kinds of plants were shaping people's most intense spiritual, magical, and visionary experiences. Today, we begin a chronological exploration of medieval entheogenic evidence, with a focus on how alchemy, witchcraft, and occult plant knowledge quietly infused European spiritual life with altered states of awareness. Medieval Europe was officially defined by Christian liturgy and sacramental theology. Yet, beneath this orthodox surface existed a dense undergrowth of folk magic, herbal medicine, and esoteric experimentation, with plants that affected perception and trance. The word entheogen is modern, coined to describe visionary sacraments that generate the divine within, but it accurately captures how certain medieval practices use psychoactive herbs to access realms of saints, spirits, angels, and demons. Village healers and cunning folk medicine practitioners carried forward pre-Christian plant lore, working with species like mandrake, henbane, belladonna, and datura, baneful members of the nightshade family whose tropane alkaloids can induce vivid hallucinations of flight, transformation, and spirit contact. Inquisitorial records and demonological manuals later codified these practices under the label of witchcraft, describing flying ointments and nocturnal sabbats that contemporary historians interpret as entheogenic experiences, framed in the language of diabolical conspiracy. At the same time, alchemical systems treated plants as carriers of hidden virtues and celestial signatures, distilling their spirits into quintessences and tinctures that were meant to heal the body and elevate the soul, paralleling other global entheogenic spiritual systems in which plant sacraments mediate between worlds. Natural philosophers and physicians gradually began to catalog these herbs more systematically, debating how they affected imagination, dreams, and the subtle spirits believed to circulate between body and soul. By the Renaissance, thinkers like Paracelsus and Giambattista della Porta reframed occult herbalism as a kind of experimental natural magic, while explorers and later proto-ethnobotanists observed indigenous entheogenic rites abroad, forcing Europeans to reconsider the religious significance of psychoactive plants. Across this long arc of time, medieval entheogenic practices, whether condemned as witchcraft or encoded in alchemical symbolism, fed into broader esoteric currents like Hermeticism, Christian Cabala, and later Rosicrucianism, where altered states of awareness were prized as gateways to the invisible. Understanding this hidden history allows us to see medieval Europe not only as an age of dogma and persecution, but also as a laboratory of spiritual experimentation, where plants served as powerful technologies for exploring the metaphysical matrix of body, psyche, and cosmos. In European esoteric, alchemical, and witchcraft traditions, philosophical wines, tinctures, and brews containing psychoactive plants facilitated visionary experience, practices that were later suppressed by institutional authorities. As seen in the Chinese history of entheogenic use, and the Taoist move from Weidon or external elixirs to Neidon or internal alchemy, these sacraments were likewise reframed as images of inner transformation, so that the elixir became a symbol for refined consciousness, and the philosopher's stone a metaphor for stabilized realization. In medieval Europe, witches were often depicted as crafting potions and brews containing psychoactive herbs like henbane, nightshade, belladonna, mandrake, and psychoactive mushrooms that enabled visionary experiences and communion with cosmic or spiritual forces. These practices became a primary target for persecution by institutional orthodoxy, seeking to suppress unsanctioned spiritual power. Yet, the grammar of ascent, union, and transformation persisted symbolically in mystical and occult frameworks, a pattern echoed today in psychedelic-assisted spirituality, where leaders and clinicians navigate ethical integration and discern genuine insight from novelty or destabilization. Before we begin, I want to take a moment and thank our monthly members. You help to fuel the enlightening education that benefits many around the world. Your support enables S.E.E.K to continue creating content, providing a path for all spiritual seekers. Support us with a monthly membership on YouTube, Patreon, or Ko-Fi at Join S.E.E.K. or on Facebook at JoinSeek1. Become a member and you will see your name in future videos. Thank you. To begin our exploration, we'll start at the early medieval crossroads, where monastic herbalism, folk healing, and lingering pagan sensibilities first shape European ideas about visionary plants. As we move through this period, pay attention to how everyday remedies, devotional practices, and fears of sorcery begin to crystallize into a recognizable entheogenic subculture. In the early Middle Ages, roughly from the fall of the Western Roman Empire into the 11th century, Europe's spiritual landscape was a patchwork of Christian institutions layered over older local cosmologies that regarded plants as living beings with spirits, powers, and voices of their own. Monasteries became key centers of herbal knowledge, preserving late antique texts such as Dioscorides and Pseudo-Apuleius, while maintaining gardens where medicinal and sometimes psychoactive plants were cultivated, cataloged, and cautiously administered. Herbs like poppy, henbane, and mandrake appear in these traditions as agents for inducing sleep, dulling pain, or casting out intrusive spiritual influences, functions that in practice often blurred into guided dreams, visionary prayer, or trance-like states used for healing and divination. Among the rural populace, cunning folk healers and wise women inherited oral lore about what some later writers would call veneficium, the dangerous art of poisoning and witchcraft, where the same plants could be turned toward more overt magical and ecstatic ends. In this context, an ointment or potion was not merely a pharmacological mixture, but an invitation to plant spirits and local deities or saints to participate in ritual, much as shamans in other cultures invoke the indwelling intelligence of entheogenic allies like mushrooms, cacti, or vines. While Christian authorities tolerated much of this as long as it could be framed as pious healing, doctrinal anxieties grew around practices that seemed to bypass clerical control, especially those involving nighttime gatherings, erotic symbolism, and experiences of leaving the body to travel through uncanny landscapes. Hagiographies, or stories of saints, sometimes describe holy figures whose visions are preceded by unusual fasting, incense, or ingestion of bitter herbs, suggesting that altered states of awareness were tactily acknowledged within the devotional mainstream, even if not explicitly tied to specific psychoactive plants. Simultaneously, popular tales began to crystallize around figures who ride through the night, join processions of the wild hunt, or participate in assemblies led by mysterious women or spectral queens, motifs that some scholars link to shamanic flight traditions refracted through Christian demonology. When ecclesiastical authorities later sought to suppress these currents, they often did so by focusing on the material accompaniments of such journeys, brews, salves, and fumigations, which they interpreted as tools of sorcery even as they preserved crucial clues about medieval entheogenic practice. Within learned medicine, theories of humors and spirits posited that certain fumes and concoctions could influence the animal spirit, the subtle force mediating between sense perception and rational soul, providing an intellectual framework for understanding how plants might open doors to dreams or visions. Early alchemical texts circulating in Latin and Arabic further expanded these ideas, describing plant distillations as extracting a volatile spirit that could transform metals and humans alike, prefiguring later efforts to harness psychoactive effects as part of spiritual and philosophical work. Historians and researchers of esoteric texts have highlighted explicit references to cannabis and its visionary uses embedded within alchemical and magical manuscripts tied to Jewish mysticism. In broader alchemical allegories, the phrase green lion frequently represents the raw, unrefined life force of plant sap. Similarly, ancient alchemists and hermetic philosophers like Zosimos of Panopolis utilized the legendary plant moly, which Hermes gave to Odysseus in the Odyssey, as an allegorical catch-all term for an entheogen or magical plant used to safely navigate the realms of altered awareness. If we place European developments alongside contemporaneous entheogenic traditions in India, Central Asia, and the Americas, where sacraments like soma, hauma, and mushroom rites were explicitly linked to divine encounter, we can see that medieval Europe, too, was negotiating how plant-induced ecstasy fit into its evolving theology. The difference was that, in Europe, this negotiation happened mostly under the sign of suspicion and silence, pushing entheogenic practices to the margins where they survived in coded language, folk stories, and the discrete activities of healers, midwives, and visionary practitioners. If it is still unclear why an institutional religious hierarchy would be at odds with entheogenic experience across the world throughout medieval history and into the modern day, the answer is both obvious and occult. As the mysteries of soma, hauma, kykeon, peyote, ayahuasca, Amanita muscaria, and psilocybin mushrooms were codified into priestly hierarchies, the inner illumination that they provoked threatened the literal and social order, leading spiritual systems to cloak psychoactive elixirs in allegorical language, preserving the gnosis or direct experience while concealing the initiatory ascent from the unprepared masses. All of this sets the stage for the high and late medieval periods, when intensifying witchcraft persecutions and the rise of more systematic alchemy would bring the entheogenic dimensions of plant lore into sharper, if contested, focus. We've laid the groundwork by tracing how early medieval herbalism and folk magic quietly cultivated entheogenic pathways to vision and healing under the watchful gaze of the Church. In the next section, we'll move into the late medieval and early Renaissance world, where flying ointments, witch trials, and alchemical allegories reveal just how deeply psychoactive plants were woven into Europe's spiritual imagination. As we transition into the high medieval and early Renaissance periods, the entheogenic undercurrents of European plant lore begin to surface more dramatically in witchcraft trials, flying ointment narratives, and increasingly sophisticated alchemical texts. This is the era when psychoactive herbs become central to debates about diabolic illusion, visionary flight, and the boundaries between medicine, magic, and emerging natural philosophy. From roughly the 12th to the 15th centuries, church, state, and popular imagination converged to produce a recognizable witch figure, whose alleged powers of flight, transformation, and nocturnal congregation were intimately tied to the use of potent plant-based salves and potions. Records describe witches and cunning folk healers using greenish ointments composed of henbane, mandrake, belladonna, datura, hemlock, and other solanaceous herbs, applied to the skin rather than ingested, to avoid lethal toxicity while harnessing their extraordinary psychotropic effects. Under the influence of tropane alkaloids like hyoscine, atropine, and scopolamine, practitioners reported experiences of flying to sabbats, dancing with spirits, communing with the devil, or traveling to distant gatherings, journeys that contemporary researchers interpret as entheogenic trance flights structured by Christian demonological imagery. Henbane or Hyoscyamus niger was often included in the witches' brews and other toxic preparations of medieval Europe to cause visual hallucinations and the sensation of flight. An annual or biennial native to Europe, it has long been valued in medicine as a sedative and an anodyne to induce sleep. The principal alkaloid of henbane is hyoscyamine, but the more hallucinogenic scopolamine is also present in significant amounts, along with several other alkaloids in smaller concentrations. Henbane is one of 20 species of Hyoscyamus, members of the nightshade family, Solanaceae. They are native to Europe, Northern Africa, and Western and Central Asia. Demonological texts and confessions, often coerced, speak of broomsticks, animal familiars, and unholy ointments, revealing not only the pharmacology of medieval vinificium, but also the symbolic frameworks that gave meaning to altered states, much as other cultures anchor entheogenic visions in myths of gods and ancestral spirits. Parallel to these witchcraft discourses, alchemical authors expanded their plant work, experimenting with distillations, fermentations, and extractions to produce quintessences thought to refine the inner life and awaken spiritual insight. Within these workshops, psychoactive herbs were understood as embodying powerful astral signatures, possibly Saturnian or martial qualities, making them valuable, if perilous, tools for exploring thresholds between life and death, body and soul. As natural magic matured, thinkers began to argue that these phenomena were part of a lawful, though subtle, natural order, rather than purely demonic, suggesting that entheogenic experiences could be reinterpreted as aspects of the metaphysical matrix connecting humans, plants, and cosmos. At the same time, medical practice continued to rely on sedative and analgesic concoctions that, intentionally or not, induced experiences of disembodiment, dreamlike visions, and mystical encounters, pushing physicians to question how chemistry, imagination, and spirit intertwined. This convergence of witchcraft, alchemy, and early natural philosophy marks a crucial phase in the history of entheogens. They are feared as instruments of diabolic deception, yet increasingly recognized as powerful pharmacological and spiritual technologies that demand serious study. Next, we need to step even further into the world of flying ointments and witchcraft accusations, where visionary plants were both criminal evidence and gateways to ecstatic experience. Then we'll follow those herbs into the alchemist's laboratory, where they became symbols of transformation in a broader esoteric science. By the 13th and 14th centuries, reports of witches anointing themselves with mysterious ointments before flying to nocturnal assemblies had become a familiar motif in both court records and theological polemic, pointing to an entrenched practice of using psychotropic salves for visionary travel. Ethnobotanical analysis of these flying ointments draw heavily on testimonies and later chemical reconstructions, which consistently feature nightshades like henbane, mandrake, and belladonna, plants whose alkaloids produce intense, immersive hallucinations that can induce sensations of flight, bodily transformation, and contact with otherworldly beings. Accounts preserved by Dominican observers tell of women rubbed with ointment falling into a deep trance, only to awaken convinced that they had journeyed to a sabbat, danced, feasted, and consorted with spirits, experiences that mirror entheogenic rites elsewhere, in which visionary episodes are treated as ontologically real travels of the soul. Spanish physician Andrés de Laguna's 16th century analysis of a confiscated ointment, which he describes as green, unguent-like, and composed of hemlock, nightshade, henbane, and mandrake, offers concrete evidence that such mixtures were pharmacologically capable of producing the reported phenomena. Modern medicinal chemistry confirms that these herbs contain compounds like hyoscine and atropine, which disrupt normal sensory processing and memory, fostering complex visionary narratives that can be remembered with the same vividness as waking life, explaining why accused witches insisted on the reality of their flights. Some scholars suggest that broomsticks may have functioned as applicators, with ointments spread onto mucous membranes to enhance absorption, a detail that transforms an iconic symbol of witchcraft into material testimony of sophisticated vernacular pharmacology. At the same time, demonologists frame these experiences within a moral universe dominated by Satan, interpreting plant-induced trance as evidence of diabolic illusions designed to lure souls into heresy and rebellion, much as other religions warn against false visions, even while honoring sanctioned entheogenic revelations. This interpretive move helped justify persecution, while inadvertently preserving descriptions of psychotropic practice, giving modern historians a window into how ordinary people experienced and narrated entheogenic states under hostile interrogation. Beyond the courtroom, alchemical texts of the period reveal a different stance. Here, plants are discussed as vehicles of transformation, their distilled spirits or tinctures capable of purifying metals and humans in parallel, often using language that blurs chemical change with spiritual ascent. Within such works, baneful herbs and powerful resins occupy liminal positions, sometimes warned against, yet hinted at as keys to a more radical shift in consciousness. reminiscent of later poison path discourses in occult herbalism, where toxic plants became teachers of death, rebirth, and shadow integration. Medieval Rosicrucian precursors and Christian Kabbalists, though later in time, would inherit this plant-centered symbolism, integrating it into visionary programs aimed at angelic contact and inner alchemical transmutation, paralleling global traditions where entheogens serve as sacraments of spiritual metamorphosis. In medical practice, practitioners experimented with mixtures for anesthesia, pain relief, and psychiatric disturbance, inadvertently stumbling into entheogenic territory when patients reported encounters with angels, demons, or deceased relatives during episodes of deep sedation or delirium. Taken together, these developments show a culture grappling with psychoactive plants on multiple fronts, as evidence in witchcraft trials, as tools in magical and alchemical work, and as challenging medicines that force physicians and theologians to reconsider how material substances can open onto spiritual realities. In this convergence, the medieval European story begins to resemble other entheogenic frameworks worldwide, where the same substance can be medicine, poison, sacrament, or sorcery, depending on dose, context, and narrative, a complexity that will continue to shape their fate in later centuries. We've now seen how high medieval witchcraft narratives and alchemical experiments turn psychoactive plants into flashpoints of theological fear and esoteric fascination. In the next section, we'll meet natural philosophers who began to reinterpret occult plant knowledge as part of a broader systematic exploration of nature, setting the stage for early modern science and global entheogenic comparison. Now we enter the world of Renaissance natural philosophers, where figures like Paracelsus and Giambattista della Porta begin to reinterpret occult plant knowledge through a new blend of alchemy, medicine, and experimental natural magic. In this phase, entheogenic and psychotropic plants are no longer only tools of witches and folk magicians. They become objects of systematic study, symbolic theology, and proto-scientific inquiry that link medieval Europe to global traditions of visionary pharmacology. Paracelsus, active in the early 16th century, revolutionized European medicine by insisting that true understanding of plants and minerals came from direct experience and alchemical analysis, not merely from inherited scholastic texts. He proposed that each herb contained an inner arcane virtue, revealed through distillation and fire, and that this virtue could act on body, psyche, and spirit in ways that transcended conventional humoral theory, opening the door to a more entheogenic reading of certain powerful botanicals. Paracelsian medicine and later chemical philosophies reframed the body as a site of subtle interactions between botany and vital forces, blurring the line between alchemy and what would become chemistry. Paracelsus extensively experimented with plants, minerals, and alchemical substances for medicinal and spiritual purposes, and his writing suggests familiarity with psychoactive herbs such as mandrake, henbane, and other vision-inducing plants. Drawing on the doctrine of signatures, Paracelsus argued that God had inscribed clues in the forms and colors of plants, but emphasized that their deeper internal signatures, often accessed through alchemical work, were what truly disclosed their medicinal and occult potentials. Paracelsus approached plants with a radically different sensibility than many of his contemporaries, arguing that their true powers could only be known by extracting their inner arcana through alchemical processes, which separated and recombined sulfur, salt, and mercury to reveal deeper medicinal and spiritual properties. In his writings, he describes how distillation, calcination, and fermentation transform crude herbs into potent balsam and tinctures, substances that do more than treat physical symptoms. They act on the invisible principles and spirits within the human being, suggesting a framework in which certain plants could operate as entheogenic catalysts for inner change. Although Paracelsus does not use modern vocabulary, his emphasis on the arcane, psycho-spiritual dimension of plant medicines resonates with the way contemporary practitioners describe visionary plants as teachers, allies, or vehicles for revelation. He also integrated astrology into his botany, assigning plants to planetary rulers and arguing that effective remedies had to harmonize with cosmic rhythms, an approach that places psychoactive herbs within a larger esoteric architecture connecting microcosm and macrocosm. In this light, the same nightshades that fueled witches' flying ointments could be reinterpreted, under careful dosing and ritual framing, as tools for confronting Saturnian and martial energies, like death, limitation, aggression, and shadow, akin to the poison path concept in later occult herbalism, where baneful plants facilitate deep initiatory work. Occultists and natural philosophers experimented with herbal concoctions, fumes, and tinctures, occasionally stumbling upon more visionary combinations, but generally operating without a clear conceptual distinction between entheogens, poisons, and ordinary medicinal agents. By situating medieval poison path plants within this broader Renaissance and early modern reevaluation of nature, we can see how entheogens became bridges between esoteric cosmology, emerging experimental science, and comparative religious thought. To understand this transformation more clearly, we will move beyond Paracelsus and see how other natural philosophers and explorers brought in the entheogenic conversation beyond Europe. Watch how visionary plants move from being used as evidence in witch trials to keys in a philosophical and global investigation of consciousness. In parallel, Giambattista della Porta's Magiae Naturalis, or natural magic, cataloged plants with dormitive and delirium-inducing properties, like mandrake, belladonna, henbane, poppy, and stramonium, describing how they could plunge people into sleep, madness, and animal-like behaviors, inadvertently providing a Renaissance pharmacology of entheogenic and psychotropic herbs. Della Porta treats these phenomena as marvels of nature rather than as solely demonic tricks, positioning visionary and delirious states within a continuum of natural effects that can be studied, replicated, and in some cases ritually directed. This natural magic intersects with esoteric Christianity and Hermeticism, where altered states are valued for revealing hidden correspondences and angelic messages, echoing global entheogenic frameworks in which plants serve as sacraments of revelation. Giambattista della Porta complements this vision by spelling out detailed observations of psychotropic effects. He notes that mandrake in new wine induces sleep followed by a day of raving madness, while stramonium seeds and belladonna roots can make people behave like animals, swimming like fish, or walking like geese. These descriptions align closely with modern accounts of anticholinergic delirium, where tropane alkaloids disrupt neurotransmitters and produce immersive, often bizarre hallucinations that feel entirely real to the experiencer. Unlike demonologists, della Porta does not immediately moralize these effects. Instead, he treats them as natural wonders, marvelous but lawful phenomena that can be cataloged, reproduced, and studied as part of a broader inquiry into the miracles of nature. His work straddles the boundary between magical grimoire and scientific handbook, echoing other spiritual systems in which entheogens are simultaneously sacred and pharmacological, blurring distinctions between ritual and experiment. Later commentators and occultists would draw on his recipes for sleep-inducing wines, aromatic fumigations, and complex herbal mixtures, sometimes repurposing them for visionary and divinatory work that parallels the ecstatic experiences described in witchcraft records. Meanwhile, Paracelsian physicians extended signature theory beyond external resemblance, focusing on internal signatures revealed by distillation and fire analysis, thereby legitimizing the search for subtle occult properties within plants that might influence imagination, dreams, and the soul's relation to the body. Natural philosophers like Johann Heinrich Cohausen, who studied the visionary effects of morning glory seeds in Europe, as well as others, influenced by Paracelsian ideas, debated substances that affect longevity, inner vitality, and imagination, suggesting a growing interest in how plant-derived preparations interact with the subtle spirits of the human organism. At the same time, European explorers and missionaries in the Americas and elsewhere reported indigenous use of tobacco, peyote, mushrooms, and other entheogens in ritual context, narratives that implicitly invite comparisons between European witches' ointments and native sacraments like the peyote vision quest or mushroom communion. For some European readers, these reports confirm suspicions that plant-induced visions were diabolic or primitive. For others, they sparked fascination with the possibility that global religious experience had deep roots in psychoactive flora, anticipating later ethnobotanical and comparative mysticism. Seen together, Paracelsus's alchemical medicine, della Porta's natural magic, and early ethnographic glimpses of entheogenic rites abroad mark a pivotal shift. Medieval poison plants leave the exclusive domain of witchcraft and enter an expanding discourse that treats them as agents within a lawful cosmos, bridging theology, esotericism, and nascent science. This transformation sets the stage for the 18th and 19th centuries, when systematic chemistry, pharmacology, and ethnobotany will begin isolating active principles from these botanicals and formalizing their role in the study of consciousness and religion. As the Enlightenment progressed, and with it the rise of experimental science, the study of mind-altering plant sacraments moved gradually from the domain of magic and folklore into emerging disciplines such as neurology, psychiatry, and pharmacology. We've watched medieval entheogens pass through the hands of witches, alchemists, and natural philosophers, becoming part of a broader conversation about nature's secrets and the lawful structure of visionary experience. These currents flow into the 19th century, preparing the ground for modern scientific and occult entheogenic engagement. As we come to the threshold of the modern era, the medieval and Renaissance poison path of nightshades, alchemical tinctures, and witch ointments begin to intersect with explorers' journals, natural history, and the earliest stirrings of ethnobotany. By the 18th century, European empires had spread across the globe, and naturalists, missionaries, and explorers were documenting plants and indigenous lifeways with unprecedented detail, including practices that we now recognize as entheogenic. Figures like William Bartram and other observers helped carry occult plant lore and entheogenic curiosity toward the 19th century, where scientific chemistry and comparative religion will radically reshape the story. William Bartram's travels through the North and South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida regions in the 1770s is best known for its lyrical descriptions of landscapes, yet embedded in his narrative are careful observations of Native American botanical practices, including the ritual and social use of tobacco and other plants that modulate consciousness. Bartram carefully described Native American uses of botanicals in healing, ceremony, and social life, preserving fragments of pharmacological and spiritual knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. Although Bartram did not frame these rites in modern psychedelic terms, his accounts of tobacco rituals, communal gatherings, and visionary practices form part of a growing archive that links indigenous plant sacraments to the broader history of entheogens. Historians of pharmacology note that Bartram recorded indigenous names, preparation methods, and perceived effects of various herbs, thereby preserving a body of knowledge that would later inform both medical botany and ethnographic studies of entheogenic traditions. In these contexts, plants served not only as remedies for physical ailments, but as mediators of communal identity, spiritual guidance, and visionary experience, echoing the roles played by medieval European flying ointments and alchemical elixirs in smaller, more clandestine circles. As Bartram and other naturalists cataloged flora, their specimens and notes fed into herbarium collections and taxonomic systems that increasingly treated plants as discrete species with measurable properties, providing a scaffold on which later chemists would isolate active compounds from long-feared botanicals like nightshades and ergot. In collaboration, Benjamin Smith Barton wrote on the psychoactive and toxic properties of datura stramonium or Jimson weed, often using Bartram's first-hand accounts to profile the plants. Carl Linnaeus, the foundational Swedish botanist, documented the properties and traditional shamanic use of Amanita muscaria or fly agaric mushrooms, and identified the stimulant effects of coffee and coca. Alexander von Humboldt, the famous Prussian explorer and polymath, documented various entheogens and stimulating flora throughout the Americas, observing indigenous preparations of psychoactive plants during his 1799 to 1804 expedition. At the same time, European scholars were beginning to synthesize global evidence of psychoactive plant use, from Old Testament references and Near Eastern resins to American cacti and mushrooms, arguing that altered states played a recurring role in religious symbolism and mythology. This emerging comparative perspective cast new light on medieval European poison path traditions, suggesting that witches' ointments and alchemical elixirs belong to a worldwide family of practices in which plants mediate between humans and the sacred. As chemistry advanced, researchers learned to isolate active constituents from long-known botanicals, showing that the devil's herbs of medieval lore contained specific molecules responsible for their visionary and delirious effects, bridging folk magic and pharmacology. Before our story comes to a close, we'll follow these currents as they converge around the rise of systematic plant science and cross-cultural investigations into visionary plants across global spiritual history. Here, entheogens emerge as key topics in chemistry, medicine, and mystical spirituality. Esoteric currents, such as Rosicrucianism, Christian Cabala, and later occult revivals, continued to treat plants as spiritual allies, integrating medieval images of flying, transformation, and angelic contact into new ritual systems that anticipated the 19th century occult and spiritualist movements. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, these strands set the stage for a more explicit scientific and esoteric engagement with entheogens. In this way, medieval entheogenic evidence does not end in the witch trial records or alchemical treatises. It flows forward into modernity, shaping how later generations will define, study, and experience visionary plants. Rather than being anomalous or uniquely diabolic, medieval poison path practices could be understood as one local expression of a much older and wider tendency for humans to use plants to seek divine encounter. Medicinal chemistry, especially in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, began isolating and naming compounds, like morphine from opium, later mescaline from cacti, and various alkaloids, that made the effects of historic witches' brews and visionary elixirs intelligible in molecular terms. This process did not erase the spiritual dimension. Instead, it created new tensions and opportunities as doctors experimented with anesthetics and sedatives that reproduced experiences of disembodiment and luminous visions, once reserved for folk healers and occultists. Occult and esoteric thinkers in the 18th and 19th centuries, drawing on earlier Paracelsian and della traditions, continued to explore poison herbs as initiatory tools, embedding medieval imagery of flight, astral travel, and spiritual ascent into new ritual orders that bridged Christian mysticism, Hermetic symbolism, and nature-based magic. Some Rosicrucian and Christian Kabbalistic sources hint at plant-based entheogens associated with angelic transformations and inner alchemy, connecting the witch's ointment lineage to more elite, text-based esoteric programs. As comparative religion emerged in the 19th century, scholars increasingly recognized that entheogens were not marginal curiosities, but central to many traditions, from Vedic Soma and Iranian Hauma, to Mesoamerican mushroom cults, to African and Siberian ecstatic plant rites, forcing a reevaluation of European history in light of global patterns. In this reevaluation, medieval European evidence, like witchcraft records, alchemical recipes, natural magic manuals, and explorers' field notes, provide a crucial case study in how a Christian society negotiated, persecuted, and secretly preserved entheogenic practice. In the early modern period, European encounters with psychoactive plants like tobacco, coffee, cacao, and coca shaped medical, social, and esoteric practices. While these substances were not typically psychedelic in the strict sense, their effects on mood, attention, and social ritual helped normalize the idea that chemical agents could powerfully modulate consciousness and behavior. By the time 19th century scientists and ethnographers turned explicitly to peyote, cannabis, and other spiritual sacraments, they inherit a conceptual vocabulary shaped by centuries of engagement with witch herbs, poison path lore, and the alchemical quest for tinctures that transform perception and soul. The chemist Augustus Everard Brand documented psychoactive mushroom intoxication with Psilocybe similanciata in a British family who prepared a meal with mushrooms they picked in London's Green Park, documented in the November 16, 1799 issue of the Medical and Physical Journal. The father and 4 children experienced typical symptoms associated with ingestion: pupil dilation, spontaneous laughter, and hallucinations. In this sense, the medieval story is not an isolated chapter, but a deep-root system beneath modern psychedelic science, occult revival movements, and contemporary interest in plant-based spirituality. In our next video, join us as we follow these roots further into the 19th century, where chemists and physicians isolate alkaloids from long-feared witch plants and new exotic species, turning medieval brews into measurable, dose-specific medicines and mind-altering compounds. We will explore how early ethnobotanists and anthropologists document indigenous entheogenic rites in unprecedented detail, transforming scattered travel accounts like Bartram's into systematic studies of plant-based spirituality. We will examine how occult orders, spiritualist circles, and emerging psychological theories reinterpret entheogens as tools for inner alchemy, mystical experience, and the scientific exploration of consciousness, bridging medieval poison paths with modern psychedelic paradigms. Join us next time as we move from medieval entheogenic evidence in alchemy, witchcraft, and occult plant knowledge into the 19th century world of scientific, ethnobotanical, and esoteric advancements that will redefine entheogens for the modern age. Where will our expansive exploration of entheogenic or psychedelic plants found throughout global spiritual history take us after the 19th century? Like and subscribe to find out. Thank you for watching. Find more at joinseek.org.